1/3 of all of the world's energy comes from oil. About 80% comes from fossil fuels. Oil is the single largest provider of energy in the entire world. In that context, COVID has unleashed a firestorm in not only the oil industry, but energy more broadly. How is COVID affecting the oil industry? Well, first off, there's been a significant decrease in the price of oil. You can see here in this graph the price of oil over the past 2 years, and especially the dip that happened earlier in 2020. Now, since then, the price has recovered slightly, going at its lowest below $20 average in April, but now returning closer to $40 right now in June. Overall, this year, the International Energy Agency expects that demand for oil will be down by an average of 8.1 million barrels per day in 2020. This downturn in the price and demand for oil has caused a downturn in investment. This year is supposed to be the largest decrease in energy investment in the history of the recorded world. Energy investments will decline by $400 billion this year. Oil is, quote unquote, bearing the brunt of this decline, according to the IEA, declining by about 1/3. Now, in this context, there are certain organizations that have begun to celebrate or anticipate the so-called end of oil. One of those is from Carbon Tracker, which provides a lot of interesting analysis of the renewable energy boom. They released a report earlier in June called Decline and Fall. And in this, they said, we are witnessing a decline and fall of the fossil fuel system. In their report, they described this as a terminal decline. And this graph they have here basically is looking at different dates at which different aspects of fossil fuels began declining. So you can see fossil fuels in general and oil in particular begin to peak, quote unquote, in terms of their demand in 2019. Now, this kind of sentiment is not just coming from this one group. You can see this in popular news. Is this the end of the oil era? This is what the end of the oil age looks like. Michael Clare, a famous writer, says the beginning of the end of oil, end for oil. All of these represent some of the sentiment that is happening right now. And just something to keep in mind is that a sort of deeper academic context for this is the literature around stranded assets. Now, in this presentation, I am going to ask this question. Is this really the beginning of the end of oil? Is that really what's going on? What is the more complex picture? Now, originally I titled this talk, The Never-Ending End of Oil. If I were to sort of reframe the talk a little bit, after having developed it more, I would call it something like carbon purgatory. And this idea of carbon purgatory is going to be the central idea I'm going to try to convince you of in this discussion. So let me explain a little bit more what I mean by this term carbon purgatory and why it's relevant to this question of the end of oil. So there are two different energy transitions that are possible. One is perhaps what we see in some of these commentators who are saying that the end of oil is beginning right now, and that the distress due to COVID and more broadly in the energy markets is going to cause a perennial decline in the use of oil, ending essentially the fossil fuel industry in some period of time. Now, how I describe this kind of energy transition is, well, it's a little bit more clear-cut, it's a little bit more ordered, a little bit more smooth, it's a little bit more directed, expedient, clear. We're saying it's ending and it's going to keep on going down. Now, what I'm going to try to convince you of is that that's not really what's happening, and that the more complex picture is a bit more troublesome. This is just a sort of squiggly line that I put down for this presentation, but it represents what I am calling carbon purgatory. And what these lines would kind of refer to is both the price and investment for oil, And the idea that I'm trying to communicate here with this second sort of squiggly line is that while it may be the case that overall we're seeing a decline in oil use, that decline in oil use is likely going to be much more chaotic and volatile with significant ups and downs that prolong the transition and cause the transition to have negative impacts on many people throughout the world. And I'll explain more what I mean by that. This is chaotic, volatile, disruptive, prolonged, dangerous. So what do I mean by carbon purgatory? The end of oil will be a period of extreme volatility where the future demand, supply, and price of oil are uncertain. In other words, instead of having this kind of clear-cut, anticipated, somewhat orderly decline, we're going to have volatile, uncertain, slow decline. Within this, capital's inability to firmly decide on an energy future, in other words, its inability to decide, hey, we want to go 100% renewables, or we want to keep with fossil fuels, will disrupt economic growth and prolong this painful period of transition. Stuck in between two energy systems, the global population will suffer from volatile energy prices and, most importantly, delayed climate action. Okay, so this idea of carbon purgatory comes from my completed dissertation work here at UC Berkeley, which was made possible through the Distinguished Graduate Fellowship. My basic question in my dissertation has been, how has the political economy of the global oil industry changed in response to the ongoing contested energy transition? And I've looked at different aspects of this. One aspect is strategies. This is a photo here, a satellite photo of fracking in the Permian Basin, which has been a large part of my dissertation, looking at how fracking is one strategy the oil industry is using to weather this storm of uncertainty and transition that's happening. But another side of what I've been looking at is just better understanding the nature of the crisis afoot. And this is what is relevant to today's talk on carbon purgatory. And the kinds of sites I've been looking at, well, I've been looking at data streams, research and reports from the major oil companies, from the various consultancy firms which go and work for them, for also looking at a variety of major oil conferences where one can get perhaps a more deep or nuanced understanding of the problems in the industry that are not always brought to light in the more public eye. Likewise, interviews with major energy figures in the financial press. And finally, the work and concerns of the International Energy Agency, which is sort of the global watchdog that seeks to regulate energy production and consumption for the world's wealthiest countries. Okay, so to understand this idea of carbon purgatory, we're going to first have to understand this idea of uncertainty in the oil industry. So what I want to kind of convince you of is that the future of oil is extremely uncertain right now. And this is going to play a big role in why we're stuck in this sort of carbon purgatory of not being able to choose our energy future. So one of the reasons why the future of oil is uncertain is that people are very confused about when peak oil demand will come. And another reason is that prices have been extremely volatile, and this has left investment scratching their head. Let's look at both in greater detail. So, uncertain peak demand. This is Erik Verenes, the chief economist of Equinor, formerly Statoil in Norway. He says, so then, what is the need for new oil investments? What is oil demand going to be in 2050? I have to tell my boss, the CEO of Equinor, well, it depends. 60 million barrels per day if you believe in the renewable scenario, or 120 per day if you believe in the rivalry scenario, which is Equinor's sort of business as usual forecast. And he concludes by making the point, this is a really bad forecast. Let's examine a little bit more what it means here. This is the International Energy Agency's forecast from a few years ago, and you can see two dotted lines, the NPS and the SDS. The NPS is the new policy scenario. The SDS is the sustainable development scenario. If you go out to 2040 and you look at the difference between the two in terms of the amount of oil that's needed per day, it's a huge gap. It's beyond 20 million barrels per day, 30 million barrels per day, basically a third of oil production. And if you think about that gap, well, the amount of money one prediction requires versus the other prediction requires is quite extreme. Whether or not you, depending on which scenario you choose, very different scales of investment need to be made today or in the next 5 or 10 years to meet that demand. So anyways, this idea that I just discussed is the idea that the oil industry is uncertain about when demand will peak, and thus that is causing some problems in terms of understanding when to invest or when not to invest. Okay, let's look at a second thing that's causing uncertainty in the oil industry. I've already jumped the slide here. Extreme economic volatility. On the right, you see prices for oil. I think this is adjusted for inflation, West Texas intermediate prices. And what you see is that while there was a little bit of volatility, especially around the first Gulf War prior to the mid-2000s and post-OPEC crisis of the 1970s and early 80s, generally there's a period of calm in the late 80s, 90s, early 2000s. That gets completely transformed in the mid-2000s. So you have oil going to its largest price ever right before the financial crash in 2008. And then it's just remained extremely volatile ever since, with an especially important drop 2014 to 2016, where oil prices plummeted. And again, another drop with COVID, which is the very end of the graph there. Now, key thing I want to emphasize here is that this state of volatility, according to the oil industry, appears here to stay. That's according to Deloitte, they're a major consultancy firm. This is a paper, Sherwin et al., 2018, just quantitatively making the case that volatility and unpredictability are on the rise in energy. So one might ask this question, well, okay, that's great, but isn't it the case that the oil industry has always been volatile? And that's true. The supply and demand for oil are inelastic. So for example, if you go and invest in a conventional oil well right now, you're going to spend a lot of that money investing in that oil well up front. So you might spend billions of dollars up front and then expect that payout to happen over decades. Furthermore, should the prices drop, it actually hurts the long-term recovery of oil from that well to kind of shut down production midway through. Because of that, you can't very easily take supply off the market, and thus supply is inelastic. Simultaneously, demand is inelastic because it's not the case where, oil drops by 25% and then all of a sudden everyone's driving 4 times more. No, oil is one of those things that we consume on a daily basis for necessities. Something like what's happening with COVID is really a remarkable and unprecedented drop in demand, and it really shows what is necessary, a complete lockdown of large parts of society to substantially reduce oil demand. Now, this issue of volatility has been discussed in many literatures on oil. In the critical geography literature, Matt Huber talks about it in one of his essays, 2011. He makes the point that oil requires the creation of scarcity through monopoly enforcing violence. In other words, to avoid this volatility, you need monopolies that can violently enforce scarcity on the markets to create stability. Daniel Yergin, the famous oil historian, talks about these monopoly regimes, Rockefeller oil, Rockefeller's Standard Oil, the Texas Railroad Commission, OPEC. Those are the 3 key monopolist regimes that have prevented this volatility that's inherent to the oil markets from consuming oil. A more recent work by Robert McNally, who's a former advisor to Bush, says the system of monopoly control is broken down and advises people to buckle up. In other words, again, this whole period of economic volatility that we're seeing in the oil markets is here to stay, and it troubles the oil industry. So we've got these 2 things, uncertain peak demand and extreme price volatility. Both of them are combining together to create a situation of unstable investment. How do you know what to invest and when if both of these things are troubling you? So, for example, this is looking at global investment over the past few years. You see a remarkable drop 2014 to 2016. That 2020 is an estimate taken a few years ago, and it's, of course, incorrect. In reality, what we're going to see is a drop to roughly $400 billion of money invested globally in oil this year. That's the current sort of estimate from the IEA. So again, another significant drop in oil investment. And as I made the point earlier, that drop in oil investment is concurrent with this drop in oil demand, an 8.1 million barrels per day drop in 2020. But here's the crux of the matter, is that next year, 2021, is expected to be the largest increase year on year of oil demand in history, where it will go up by 5.7 million barrels per day. And so while the energy markets are right now tapering back oil production, the sense at the moment is that oil demand will very quickly need to rise, and the supply will need to rise as well in the near future. This is why Fatih Birol, who's pictured there on the top left, the director of the IEA, describes the idea that it's the end of oil happening right now as overhyped. He says video conferencing alone will not solve our energy and climate challenges, and really calls on political intervention to ensure that this happens. Now, the result of this, and this is really key to understand, the result of this is that the global investment slowdown is set to hike oil prices and cause oversupply of 5 million barrels per day in 2025. Just to quote from this article from Rystad Energy, even though the world is currently facing what is arguably the largest oil glut ever recorded, the tables will turn dramatically in coming years. The lack of activity and investments currently planned by cost-conscious oil firms, combined with an inevitable rebound in global oil demand, is set to cause a supply deficit of around 5 million barrels per day in 2025. Causing the oil price to increase. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that we're not going to see just kind of a steady decline in oil demand. It's going to be much more volatile, and with that comes major problems of investment. Let me explain more. So this is a graph I showed you earlier. And the reason why I want to bring it up again is that I want to make the point that oil needs constant investment, but as I said earlier, investments are often long-term. So the reason why I bring this up in the context of this graph is that if you now look at the part of the graph that's colored in, that is what happens to oil production without future investments. In other words, oil will continue to produce, but it will produce less as fields naturally decline. Now, the problem is that, as I was saying earlier, oil investments are inflexible, largely speaking, especially conventional oil. You invest several $billion today, it takes several years to get production even started, and then after that, you have several decades of production until you get a return on your investment. And so this kind of long-term investment in the future of the oil industry is in a really difficult spot, because depending on where the price goes, depending on where the demand goes, that oil that could be invested in today could be completely unnecessary or could be deeply needed and underinvested in. It's a kind of catch-22 facing the oil industry. Upfront capital return over decades, that's just showing again that conventional crude oil, which is the green in that graph, the majority of oil production takes decades to go and make the money back. Now, everyone might be listening to this and say, well, okay, sounds good to me. Doesn't that mean that renewable energies will just take the place of oil? And this will be, in many ways, a happy story. As oil goes into chaos, renewable energy grows. But it doesn't work like that. 2020 is also expected to be the slowest year of renewable growth in 20 years. So renewables will continue to grow, investment will continue to grow, unlike in oil, but it's going to be very slow. Now, this is another quote from Birol. He says, if policies don't encourage a sustainable recovery, today's lockdowns, meaning like the quarantines happening today, may lead to lock-ins of obsolete and inefficient energy technologies. In other words, we might easily just go back to the same old thing unless there's significant intervention. Let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So this is looking at where energy comes from in the world. And if you see it, I mean, it's kind of staggering still. Okay, so in the past 10 years, renewables have definitely grown. Solar, wind, other renewables, those are the top three things. They've definitely grown, but they pale in comparison to the rest of energy, right? And that's what needs to be replaced. In other words, if we are going to have a decline in oil investment, if we don't have a concurrent surge in renewable energy investment, then there's a serious problem. This is from the IEA's World Energy Investment Report. They say despite growing cost competitiveness, which has supported rising development for solar PV and wind over the past decade, renewable investments are not expanding at the rate needed to align with sustainability goals. So again, putting this in context, we have this potential for the underinvestment of oil today, causing a supply difficulties in the near future. If we think about it in terms of this little investment chart I showed later, basically what it means is that on the one hand, people are scared of making the investments today because there's all of these risks involved in the uncertainty facing oil. But on the other hand, if they don't make those investments today, they risk underinvestment. 5.7 million barrels per day increase next year, as I said. So investment needed, but uncertain future prevents necessary capital. So this is what I mean by the idea of carbon purgatory. Oil is not simply on its way out in a very steady and simple fashion. Instead, what's happening is that due to the fact that there's still insufficient capital flowing to renewable energy, the oil industry, instead of just fading away, is going through these kind of bouts of these convulsions of, on the one hand, collapse in the energy market, and on the other hand, surges in prices due to underinvestment. And it's this extreme volatility that is this carbon purgatory, because it keeps energy locked in, as Fatih Birol was saying, to these old forms of energy without investing in the new ones. So let's just kind of go through some bullet points here. When oil is cheap, its displacement by renewables is discouraged, and at the same time, there's insufficient capital allocated to drive a transition. High prices, on the other hand, encourage a boom in investment, but it happens both in oil and renewable energies, and thus capital has no clear direction. It's got no clear way forward. It's not clearly going towards renewable energy, and it's not clearly going towards the oil industry, and thus it gets stuck in a period of ambiguity, volatility, and confusion. Investment in oil may decline for some period of time, like it is right now, but insufficient investment in both renewables and oil will lead to further energy volatility, right? This is this warning of a price spike in the near future because there isn't enough investment being made now. Instead of hastening the renewable energy transition, this carbon purgatory disrupts investment across all sectors of energy. Thus, while renewable energy will continue to grow, it won't grow nearly at the rate that it needs to ensure the transition we're looking for. This is just looking at oil prices again, and it's just, again, trying to illustrate this kind of chaos and volatility. With upswings in the market, you get upswings in investment. With downswings, you get downswings of investment. But the key point is that it's not just going to remain low and down. It's going to go up again. And this up and downness is what is really disrupting the energy markets. So what are the negative effects of this? Well, I've made this point, but it's going to prolong the energy transition because as investments are dampened across the board and oil is very cheap and thus very cost competitive, there's a lock-in of old inefficient technologies, namely combustion. At the same time, this volatility disrupts economic growth. Oil prices are vital for the world economy, and having this up and down price regime is disruptive. Who are most affected by this? Well, many poor people whose cost of living is very dependent on the price of oil. For example, in the lead up to the 2008 financial crash, you had a surge in commodity prices, and it's complex why it happened, but the rise in oil prices definitely helped encourage increase in food prices. Another people who are going to be affected are those who work in oil. The last oil bust, 2014 to 2016, led to 440,000 people losing their jobs worldwide, probably 1 million plus indirectly impacted on top of that. So if we take it all the way back to the beginning and return to this article we were looking at from Carbon Tracker, this report that came out, which has many valuable points and some very valuable material in it. But they make this point: we are witnessing the decline and fall of the fossil fuel system. And I just want to, again, kind of dissuade people from approaching these issues in this sort of way. I think it would be dangerous to imply that this chaos that we're seeing in the energy markets right now will ensure an energy transition. I think instead we have to really emphasize that without significant political intervention, while oil may begin to end, its end will be chaotic and volatile and damaging to not only the energy markets more broadly, including renewable energy, but towards economic growth and equality and standards of living globally. So we have these two different energy scenarios. And I just want to kind of end with a final point here, which is that just this morning, as I was preparing to make this video, the IEA actually announced a sustainable recovery plan that it's suggesting that governments take up, which is setting out $3 trillion over just 3 years to spur energy growth in renewable energy. They're basically saying, use this as an opportunity. And I think what's important about their pitch for this is that they're saying, again, unless there's significant political intervention to make this happen, this is not going to naturally happen. This is why I'm saying the idea that the disruption happening right now is in and of itself a good thing needs to be taken with a critical perspective. We don't want to in any way assume or naturalize the energy transition. Markets and this extremely volatile situation happening right now are not going to cause the energy transition that we all want. So some final conclusions to wrap things up. 1, oil's tumultuous, slow death will not be pretty or good for anyone. It leads to economic duress and depressed investments across all energy sectors, including renewable energy. 2, the world risks becoming stuck in this carbon purgatory, where oil is neither thriving nor quickly dying, and thus the world's energy system remains undecided in this indecisive space. Therefore, finally, capital has to be allocated according to planned, conscious direction. Capital cannot be allocated on the vicissitudes of this market, which are destroying and disrupting energy investments across the board. We need a scientifically directed and planned approach to taking the billions of dollars that are necessary to create a renewable future and properly and smoothly investing them today, as opposed to waiting for the markets in this chaotic period to figure it out for themselves. Thank you.